appearing virtually, Callum Hood, Head of Research for the Centre of Countering Digital Hate.
Good morning. It's great to be invited to speak to you today. I'm Callum Hood. I'm the Head of Research at the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. We are a CCDH is a US non-profit 501c3 based in Washington DC, and CCDH UK is a non-profit based in the UK as well. So we're an international organisation that looks at countering hate and disinformation by disrupting the online architecture that enables its growth. And we've done a lot of work on COVID and anti-vax during the pandemic. Just to pick, Dawn mentioned this, but when it comes to disinformation, there are some very influential individuals around the world whose motivation is primarily financial. They typically come from the sort of alternative health industry, and they have a product to sell, and they sell that product with what's sometimes been called sort of health or medical populism. So they tell you that you can't trust your doctor, you can't trust the NHS or whichever public health body it is in your the country that you live in, and that you should trust them instead, and that there's an easy solution, and it's to purchase some sort of supplement or to follow some sort of advice that they offer. We did a report called Pandemic Profiteers that looked at 12 such individuals, and they had annual revenues of around 36 million, and this is $36 million. And this is people like Joseph McCullough, who's an alternative health entrepreneur, runs the most popular alternative health website in the world, and people like Andrew Wakefield, who we know well in the UK, who's turned his scepticism about vaccines into somewhat of a business in the US as well. So that's disinformation. And then when it comes to misinformation, it sort of relates to the previous question about information overload and so on. Ordinary people trying to make sense of all this. As all of us experienced, there are big information gaps that we had, and there was a lot of anxiety about how dangerous is COVID, when will vaccines come, you know, how safe are they, how can I avoid getting COVID, and how dangerous will it be to me? And so a lot of the misinformation spread was a result of people trying to grapple with those anxieties and uncertainties, and was often informed by the disinformation. I think this is something Will mentioned, informed by the disinformation spread by more organised, determined and organised individuals like those I've just described.
Okay. Callum Hood, please. And if you can be fairly brief because we're running out of time.
Yes. I mean, I'll just say, you know, obviously people with anxieties about vaccines would often turn to social media to have those anxieties answered. And unfortunately, due to the prevalence of mis or disinformation, they would often have those anxieties or questions answered with complete falsehoods. I have to say, throughout the course of my research on these topics, it was striking how often searching for information about the latest conspiracy theory or piece of misinformation was more likely to surface more of that misinformation than reliable answers. And it was sort of gov.uk, black and white pages versus, you know, sort of somewhere down in the Google rankings versus all singing, all dancing marketing campaigns by the sort of professional disinformation spreaders that I've talked about previously. So I think there's probably some lessons to be learned about thinking of very simple and effective ways of ensuring that people who are seeking answers on some of these anxieties get the best information presented to them, you know, at top of the Google search ranking or easily accessible on social media in an engaging format.
Okay. Callum Hood, I know you want something to say here.
Yeah, I'd say really briefly, presenting lots of data and making it accessible on its own does not solve problems of misinformation. Indeed, the data often become the subject of a battle in terms of misinformation. The best example I can give of this is a US one, the VA ERS system, which records any incidents that take place after a vaccination. That was actually a demand of the anti-vaccine movement many decades ago, but it is used by anti-vaxxers today to highlight any incident that takes place after a vaccination and claim that it was caused by that vaccination, whether it was injury, sickness, whatever. So data as a whole, and when it's analysed by experts, shows that the vaccines are very safe but the data itself is then exploited by bad actors to spread misinformation. So there is a comms battle takes place over the data, even once it's out there and it's transparent and it's public, and we need to be mindful of that.
Thank you. I think, could spend all day talking about, data and collection and how we utilise it. If I just ask one more question here, though, I think one of the difficulties for me with what happened, certainly within in the UK and within in Scotland, was we used the phrase a lot, "follow the science," without actually explaining what follow the science actually means. And of course, we had the changing and evolving science as we began to understand more. So, how did governments respond to that change, and how were we able to communicate that sort of change going forward? And did that compound the difficulty that we had maintaining a communication line? I'll go to Callum first, if I could.
I'll answer very briefly. Refer back to a bit what other panellists like Tracy have said. The public have shown themselves to be capable of assessing complexities around this and to accept uncertainties around the evidence and around our theories of, how dangerous COVID is, or when we're going to get a vaccine and what they're going to look like. Things like how many vaccines we'll have to take. Many members of the public can understand the uncertainties at play here and understand it's difficult and complex. The challenge is in communicating those uncertainties and trying to fill information gaps, even if you can only fill them by giving the public the sort of balance of probabilities. And we know that there's many people who stand ready on social media to fill those gaps with their own definite and concrete answers. If we don't get there first and do that effectively.
I wanted to raise was that last week we had the Royal Society of Edinburgh giving us evidence, and they were quite keen on the idea of some kind of independent fact-checking service. So I don't know, maybe that's what some of you feel you're doing. People can check with you. But I just wondered, I don't specifically have this for anybody, but maybe Will Moy going to come in again? Is that something that we should be looking at going forward? Oh, sorry, it was Mr Hood, I think. But Mr Hood, do you want to come in, and then Tracy Brown?
Just very briefly, CCDH is not primarily a fact-checking organisation, but we are part of an ecosystem of organisations that look at the problems of misinformation and disinformation, and the work of people like Will at Full Fact is really important. It's really useful to us to have, like he says, a sort of first responder who's able to check some of the most prevalent misinformation or disinformation narratives out there, and helps us do our work holding platforms to account on their role in the spread of mis and disinformation. So fundamentally seems like a good idea to me.
Good, thanks. And Tracy Brown?